Welcome to today's USD alumni event, Diversity in Environmental Science, featuring Dr. Jennifer Prairie, Associate Professor of Environmental and Ocean Sciences. My name is Megan O'Rourke, and I'm the Associate Director of Regional Programs for the Office of Alumni Relations at USD. I'm also a proud member of the class of 2015. I have the pleasure of working with our 23 domestic Torero clubs across the country, including the Portland and Seattle Torero clubs, who are co-hosting today's program with the College of Arts and Sciences. Although we are physically apart, our amazing club committees are hard at work putting together and supporting virtual programming for our alumni to keep them engaged with and connected to the university, in addition to keeping them connected to one another. While today's event is technically set in the Pacific Northwest, its virtual setting allows Toreros from all over the country to join us for this important and informative conversation. Thank you to those who have joined us live and for those who will be watching at a later time. And speaking of watching at a later time, this event will be recorded and available on the USD Alumni Association's YouTube channel later this week. I'll introduce Dean Norton real quickly, and then we'll get on with the presentation. I know we heard a handful of things that Jenny was going to speak to us today about, so we're excited for you guys to hear. So Dean Norton, as she mentioned, joined the College of Arts and Sciences and has been a dean of the college since 2013. She joined the faculty in 1994 and previously served as Associate Dean, the co-director of USD's Living Learning Communities Program and Director of the Honors Program, all while maintaining her faculty role in the Department of Political Science and International Relations. There are a slew of wonderful things that Dean Norton has accomplished since her time at USD, and she will note some of those great things that the college is up to at the end of the presentation.
I'm really pleased to do this introduction. Today's topic, as you know, is diversity in environmental science, something we don't always think about. And so you know, in general, about why we're doing these panels, and this one in particular, is that we have a dedicated team in the college that aspires to lead cultural understanding that creates a better society, and that's what USD is known to do. But we still have a lot of work to do in this area, and that's why we decided on today's theme and all the other alumni roadshow events that you may see on the website. They're all diversity related to explore across a range of topics depending on the area. I don't know that if you've noticed that we did DC, diversity in politics. We're doing tomorrow night, if you want to join that one, cinema in LA, and we did theater in New York. And so here we are in the Northwest theme doing diversity and environmental science. I hope you're looking forward to hearing about the significance and influence and challenges in the world of environmental and ocean science as much as I am. So let's, just in case you don't know Jenny, because I think some of you are from different eras of USD. Jenny joined USD in 2014, as she said. She teaches courses on introductory marine biology and physical oceanography. Her research combines laboratory experiments and field work with mathematical modeling to study biological physical interactions in marine ecosystems, particularly focusing on plankton. Her current projects include studying marine snow formation in turbulence and zooplankton foraging in patchy environments. So Prairie's research is interdisciplinary, clearly, and focusing on how biological and physical factors interact in marine planktonic. Did I do that right? Yep, planktonic ecosystems. So today, though, she will address the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion in environmental and ocean sciences, both in relation to specific efforts at USD and in the discipline more broadly. It'll be good to hear it from both angles. She will discuss the policies and action items that the Department of Environmental and Ocean Sciences are implementing as part of their participation in the Unlearning Racism and Geosciences. And if you put those words, just the first letter of the acronym URGE, the URGE program. Jenny believes that to be effectively and justly address climate change and train the next generation of environmental leaders, we must address how the history of environmental racism and colonialism affect our discipline. So,
great. Thank you, Noelle. And
turning it over to you.
Even though Noelle is a political scientist, her daughter is a marine biologist. So,
she is. She doesn't study plankton, though.
Oh, that's okay.
He
They don't
does
all
know
have to find
R.
plankton. My whole goal is every first year student, I have to convince them to like plankton instead of whales. And it works like 2% of the time, but I take those odds. That's like, it's like everyone starts liking whales. And then I'm like, okay, but how about plankton? Your whales don't exist without my plankton. But anyways, I'm not here to talk about my research. I'm happy to talk to you about that another time if you really want to. Okay, so thanks so much for being here. I'm excited to talk about this. This is something I care a lot about. And I've been excited that we've been having really, really great discussions in our department. And so that's basically what I'm here to share with you about. This is a huge topic, so I'm really just gonna focus on a few things. And the three kind of ways I've broken up this talk are starting with the history of racism in environmental and ocean sciences, more broadly as our discipline. Two, talking about this specific program that we've been involved in called URGE, which stands for Unlearning Racism in the Geosciences. And then lastly, it's talking a little bit more specifically about USD and some of the things we're thinking about in our department. All right. So starting with some of the history. So you first can ask, well, why is it important to address the history of our field, right? Like, you know, that was in the past. And but it turns out it's not in the past, right? It shapes the current state of our discipline. You cannot disentangle the two. And so in fact, when we look at diversity in the environmental sciences, it's not good. We have a lot of problems. So there are in some ways we have made progress. And so here I'm showing you a graph of the percent of female degree recipients, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and doctorate degrees in the geosciences over the last 40 years or so. This has improved dramatically. We have seen the percent of female degree earners start, you know, in the 20% and now getting up to in the 40%, not quite at 50%, but it's much better than it used to be. And so we've seen real market change in terms of the gender gap. And you can even see like, okay, bachelor's degrees and master's degrees caught up first, and then doctorate degrees were a little bit slower, but now we're seeing closer to parity in the in terms of gender in the degree earners. There's lots of places we have not made that same kind of improvement, particularly around race. And so here is a similar graph showing the percent of degrees awarded to different underrepresented minorities. You'll see a lot of this language, underrepresented minorities. Some of the language I'm trying to switch to is historically excluded or historically minoritized, right? Because this is not groups that themselves chose to not participate, but that because of policies that we've historically enacted have been excluded from academia. So what you'll see is, since this data is just from 2010, if you just kind of glance at this quickly, you're like, oh, these bars are going up, right? You're feeling, okay, that's pretty good. You'll notice that the bars have gone up a little bit, but if you look at now the colors and what the colors of the bars relate to, you'll see that most of those gains have been in the Hispanic Latinx group. And there's been basically no change in the percent degrees awarded to Black students, American Indian students, Native and Pacific Islander students, and then those percentages across the board are quite small. To give you a little bit more context, you might say, okay, well, this is true for all STEM disciplines, and that is true, that all STEM fields have historically excluded people of color. But it turns out that in terms of geosciences, we're basically among the worst. So here I am showing a graph again since 2007, and this is percentage of underrepresented minorities by occupation. So first you'll want to look at this, and this is grouping all of what they're including as underrepresented minorities with this data. You can check out this AGI data if you want more information. I'm just showing you snapshots of this stuff, but they're grouping all of these groups together here. So keep in mind that caveat of this graph. But you'll see that that dashed gray line is showing the percentage of these groups in the US population. Okay, so that's the baseline. If there was no racism in our systems, we would see our percentage in our field be at that level. And then you see the solid black line right below that is the percent of these historically excluded groups in all occupations. And then you see the STEM disciplines way down there at 10 to 15%. And you see the blue and orange and green line for computer and math, life and physical science, and architecture and engineering. And then yellow is environmental sciences and geosciences. And you can see actually that's falling below even the other STEM disciplines. In more recent years, you've seen it maybe catch up. But the one thing I will point out is this is by occupation. And the story is much worse when you get to degrees awarded, particularly graduate degrees. So this is actually like the best case scenario that we could paint for ourselves in the geosciences. Let me just pause real quick and mention what I mean by geosciences and how that relates to our department. We are kind of a funny department, not so funny anymore. We're pretty typical in terms of most universities, but in that we don't cleanly fit in a discipline. There's many people in our department identify as being a geoscientist, and geosciences includes everything from earth sciences, atmospheric sciences, and ocean sciences. But there's also in our department people who maybe more have like ecology backgrounds, right? For me, as a biological oceanographer, I'm kind of both. In the oceanography discipline, we are part of the geosciences, but at the same time, the work I do is biological-ish in nature, right? So it's a little bit more complicated because the environmental fields are interdisciplinary, but at the same time, this is fairly representative of what we're looking at here. All right, so this is not looking very good, but the story gets worse if you look at it more carefully. And this recent study that came out in 2018 has made an argument. The title of this study was that there's been no progress in diversity in geosciences in the last 40 years. And so here is a graph from their paper. And this one on the left is showing for the last 40 years, the number of PhDs for different racial groups. And you can see the white non-Hispanic number of PhDs has risen and is now like 600. And then you see these little lines of different colors representing different groups of color that are basically at zero, one would argue. And you can, maybe if you squint at home, maybe are some of them going up a little bit, but they're all very low. And in fact, we were very lucky to have yesterday, as part of our new Human Side of Science series, Dr. Tiara Moore come and give a presentation about some of her experiences. And she pointed out that in 2019, which is the year she graduated with her PhD, there was exactly 4 PhDs earned by Black scientists in the entire US, 4. And so she said that's the year she earned her PhD. So now 25% of all the ocean science PhD earners by Black people in the US. So it's pretty dire. If you zoom in, this is the same graph, but zoomed in so that you see the y-axis only goes up to 50, so that you can see these different PhDs earned by people of color in different groups a little bit better. And first focus on the solid lines. So the solid lines go with the left y-axis. I know from our major, you've learned to read graphs really well, so that's good. In the solid lines, you'll see that these are the PhDs earned by various groups, Black people in the brown line, I'm gonna call that brown, and then the Native American PhDs earned in this green line. Both of those are, like I said, basically zero and have been flat. And then this blue line is PhDs earned by Hispanic or Latinx. And you can say, oh, look, the number of PhDs earned by Hispanic or Latinx people have gone up. You say, oh, look, it's gone up. But then I want you to pay attention to the dashed blue line. And the dashed blue line, which actually goes with the right side y-axis, is the US population in millions of Hispanic or Latinx people. And that's gone up as well. And so what this article argues is that all we've done is kept up with population growth. So any increases that we've seen, which have been very marginal at that, have just been keeping up with population growth. And so in fact, there's been no real improvement in terms of the representation of historically excluded groups in the geosciences. So that's kind of the start of this context here and why we need to address the history in our field. So let's get into that a little bit. What do we mean by the history of racism and colonialism in our field? Well, we need to start by talking about scientific racism. So what is scientific racism? Scientific racism is the pseudoscientific belief, it's important that it's not science, right? That there exists some kind of empirical evidence that can be used to justify racism or the superiority or inferiority of different racial groups. This has been importantly extremely debunked by studies in the last several decades, right, that have shown there is no scientific basis in terms of biological race. There's no biological justification for race. But race does exist, right? It's an important social construct that has shaped how we experience things in the US and elsewhere, right? And so scientific racism was promoted and pushed by a group of scientists over the last several centuries, since the 1600s. And the reason scientific racism is important is because it was used to justify really horrendous, horrific things in our society. Used to justify slavery, used to justify genocide and colonialism. It was used to justify eugenics as used by the Nazis and others, including the US, right? And it gave this kind of quote unquote scientific justification that wasn't real, right? But that's what it was used by. And so most of the scientific racism, particularly in terms of how it's famous, is founded in the fields of biology and anthropology. People looking at, in anthropology, some scientists using ideas about skull shape and things like that. Again, all have been entirely debunked. And so you might think like, well, what does this have to do with the geosciences, right? Like, oh, that's biology and anthropology's problem. Well, that's where we would be very wrong, right? And because if we think, well, what were the origins of our discipline, environmental sciences and geosciences? Well, it is entirely tied to exploration and colonialism, right? We have to think, what was the motivation for people starting to study and give funding to studying the oceans and the world, right? And particularly during this time of European colonization and imperialism, this was specifically tied to the social and historical things at the time. It cannot be disentangled from that. So this is a huge topic, and basically I thought I would just go over a few examples, but there's certainly more reading that if you're interested that you can dive into on some of this. So one of the readings that I recently did with the URGE program was on John Wesley Powell. John Wesley Powell is not someone I knew well because I didn't have go through a typical geoscience training, right? I came through math and oceanography, so I didn't hear about this. But he's very typical of American geologists, of early American geologists. And he's a very famous one. He's a man who explored the Colorado River, but as he was doing so, he did anthropological research that presupposed the racial inferiority of Native Americans. So this quote is from this article that I read. It's called The Darker Side of John Wesley Powell. So I'll put the citation there if you're interested in tracking it down. And so while he was doing this work, he downplayed topographic knowledge held by Native Americans who already knew this land very well, right? I mean, this was where they lived and for centuries. And then he also did the ethnographic work with the goal of quote unquote civilizing Native Americans. So this really problematic basis for his work. And you might think, well, who cares if just this one guy, who is this guy? Well, this guy was not a nobody. He was the director of USGS at the time and the head of the Bureau of Ethnology at the Smithsonian. So he was someone in great power who played a powerful role in governmental decisions about Native American affairs. Okay, and he is someone that's celebrated in geology textbooks as kind of this foundational figure in geology. So the important message I want to put across is that the historical context and motivation by early geologists is inseparable from their scientific contributions, right? And the discipline of geology in the US in particular was developed in parallel to westward expansion and motivated by mapping a lot of territory and removing indigenous peoples from lands, right? This is inseparable from this motivation at the time. And this article that I read is actually talks about mapping as power. So, you know, a lot of you have taken GIS as part of our thing and thinking about this powerful tool we use and who gets to make those maps and who gets to, how are those maps used? That's kind of an interesting thought. John Wesley Powell was by no means alone. Here's two other examples of really famous figures in early glaciology, in this case, Louis Agassiz and Arnold Guyot. Guyot, although I didn't come from the discipline of glaciology, I know the name Guyot because if you've taken oceanography in our department, you'll remember that's the name of these flat-topped seamounts. They're named after this guy. And so sometimes we call them table mounts instead. I'm going to opt for that name going forward. And it shows you how much of the names of these people still exist in our literature for various things, including for the names of awards and things like these. So these were two early scholars in the study of glacial history. And in fact, Agassiz is known to be the father of glaciology, made really important discoveries, right? So these scientific contributions are real. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge the racist beliefs that they held and promoted as scientists. So they were involved in something called environmental determinism, which is basically the idea that geography determines the superiority or inferiority of human races. And like the biological and anthropologic scientific racism I was talking about earlier, in the same way it was used to justify eugenics. So we as environmental scientists, geoscientists, are right at in the middle of this world. And people that you may or may not think about, for example, John Muir, who was the founder of the Sierra Club and very famous in terms of the development of our national parks, held really racist views, made derogatory comments about African Americans and Native Americans that the Sierra Club is now just starting to grapple with, right? So it's tied in a lot of our thoughts. So how does that shape our current way that we approach environmental science? Well, a lot of environmental science, and I would say the environmental movement, has really been hampered by these earlier views taking on this kind of white-centered environmentalism that has excluded the voices of many groups, right? And so in the 70s especially, there was this foundation of this movement called environmental justice. And if you want to learn more about this movement, Dr. Robert Bullard is known as the father of environmental justice. There's his website there. You can go and read. He's still an active professor and talks about all these things. And he's written many, many important things on this. So environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement. And I want to underscore that involvement of people of all races, income, and other identities in the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulation, and policies. So by doing so, right, you are making the world environmentally healthy for everyone. And because if you don't, it's going to naturally lead to something called environmental racism, which is another term associated with this movement. And so environmental racism specifically refers to environmental justice that occurs within a racialized context, right? And there's many examples of this, but I thought I would give you a few examples. Like I said, there's many examples of this. So this is just a few cherry-picked examples. We are seeing a lot of environmental racism in terms of how Alaskan natives are experiencing the effects of climate change. So for those of you who've learned about climate change from us and others, you know that particularly the higher latitudes in the Northern Hemisphere are experiencing temperature changes much faster than the global average. So because of that, erosion is eating away at land masses at a really rapid rate. This is the 70 feet a year number is in reference to a specific Alaskan Native village. The link for the story on that is below, but there's many other places to read about it. And there's an estimated that 178 Alaskan Native communities are currently threatened by erosion of land. And we are getting our first climate refugees now in the last decades, right? And so there has been 12 of these Alaskan Native villages that have had to relocate because the erosion is so extreme. In addition to the obvious erosion and flooding, right, that comes with sea ice melt and climate change, there's also lots of other impacts, including just the way to travel between different villages and to get to these villages, because they rely on the permafrost to travel over ice, right? And so if that melts, it becomes, travel becomes impossible or very difficult. And it also threatens traditional indigenous ways of hunting and fishing and other cultural practices. So lots of issues in terms of this. And this is in the US, but this is happening globally as well. For example, a lot of island nations, right, are experiencing climate change in a way that is disproportionate to how others are experiencing it, and certainly in terms of resources. Another example of environmental racism comes at how pollution is distributed. You know, if there was no environmental racism, you would think pollution would be evenly distributed, right? We would all experience pollution equally. That is not the case. And that is because of policies and decisions that are made, which are completely tied to historical inequities around deciding where people can live through processes like redlining, right, that the US has enacted over decades. And who has the power, right? What communities have the power to be part of the decision-making process about what happens to the pollution? So when I say pollution, it's referring to air pollution, traffic congestion, lead paint, hazardous waste sites, right, where you're putting various dumping grounds. And so this is a map that shows where there's low income and communities of color co-occur with really highly polluted areas. So that's what the red and orange areas show. And so there's a link here if you want to kind of link to the original interactive map, because this is just kind of a snapshot. But the main takeaway message, and this is, this is for Los Angeles, but you see this everywhere. You see this in Chicago. You see this in every major metropolitan area, that that pollution, broadly speaking, is much more prevalent in communities of color and low income communities. Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to take a quick break there and ask if there was any questions. I know this was very fast, but if there's any questions on this first part of the talk.
Actually, I'm sorry, Jenny. We don't have that much time left, believe it or not, but you are fascinating. So what I think we're going to have you do is talk about URGE and, you know, skim through that, and then what USD is doing, and then take questions if we've got some time.
Great, take questions at the end. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
And these other parts are somewhat shorter.
Yeah, that was so stuff I didn't know.
Yeah, I know, and it's too bad, because I feel like I'm not doing any of the stuff justice in terms of how much time I should talk about it. But there you go. It's a little just an intro.
It's a taste test.
So what's going on right now in our discipline? As you know, with the global protests that were sparked because of the killing of George Floyd, there's been a call for change in lots of fields, for certainly policing and lots of things that are happening in our society that clearly have institutional racism baked in, but universities are no exception, right? And so that George Floyd incident, and now the trial that just happened, clearly was the most famous and got the most press. But I'd like to actually pay a little attention to something that, in addition to the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others, was particularly striking for someone in the environmental science field. And that was actually in the same week as the killing of George Floyd. Christian Cooper, who's shown in the image on the right, was birding in Central Park. He's a blackbirder, a well-known blackbirder. And a white woman called the cops on him for just birding. And the reason this struck home, despite the fact that it luckily did not result in him losing his life, is this really spoke to the different experiences of people of color when just being in the field, right? And that's something that, as you know from being in our major, is really tied to the field of environmental sciences, being in the field and what it's like to be outside. So that's something that really also in our discipline, especially for me, I can speak personally, was something that caused reflection. And we thought, okay, we really need to be reflective. It's not enough to value diversity, right? This is not going anywhere close to enough. And so we were very lucky that a program called URGE was started by some wonderful scientists in our discipline. If you want to learn more about it, there's the website there. They have a little intro video you can watch. But basically, this program is a National Science Foundation program where it's 8 two-week sessions. And each week there's different readings and interviews with scholars in various fields about racism and about it in our field. So for example, that reading on John Wesley Powell and the history of geosciences was one of the readings. And so every 2 weeks we have these different readings. But the reason that I really like URGE is it's not just a reading or journal club, but rather your pod, you call them your pod. So we have a USD Environmental and Ocean Sciences pod. You need to make deliverables. You need to, each 2 weeks, have a specific assigned deliverable that you are going to use to enact policy change in your department or institution. So this has been a huge program that there's been over 200 registered pods in North America. There might be some outside of North America, but I kind of think it's a North American focused thing. And everything's completely public, so you can kind of see the progress in people's deliverables that they're posting. So I wanted to just give a few examples of some of the deliverables we've been working on in our department. And here's just some examples. So I wanted to point to this website at the bottom. If you go to the URGE website and you click on the pods list, you can actually see every pod that's registered, and you can go and click on ours. Ours is called USD Environmental and Ocean Sciences, so we're not too hard to find. And if you go to our pod page, you can see all of our deliverables. They're publicly accessible, and we share them. That's what you're required to do to be part of URGE. So there's an accountability there, which is very important. So some example of some of the deliverables that we've been tasked to create is looking at the demographic data in our department, developing policies for working with communities of color. We've developed admissions and hiring policies and implementing a field safety plan. So these are just some examples. There will be 8 in total. We're in session 7 right now. This is what one of them looks like. These are actually multiple pages long. So this is the last page of our admissions and hiring policy. Again, you can see them completely on the web. So I'm just kind of showing you one to see what it looks like. So what these deliverables are, they're not necessarily finalized policies, but they are specific action items and policies that we are planning to implement. And something that we had to kind of cope with in implementing this is we've had these wonderful discussions in our pod is at the end of the day, we don't want our hesitancy to make something perfect and finalized prevent us from moving forward with change. And so this nice thing about the deliverables is you submit, something good, but you submit your current state of our plans. And then after URGE is finished, we are going to develop these into finalized policies, right? The nice thing about us being a fairly small department, as you all know, we are a pretty close-knit group, is we're able to make real change, right? There's certain things that we're excited about working with the college and the university on broader things, but in terms of our department, we can make certain decisions right now. And so in terms of how we're doing our faculty hiring, how we're doing our graduate admissions, we actually added this little thing at the bottom because the deliverable instructions are kind of general because it depends on what kind of institution you're at. But because we're at a primarily undergraduate institution, we thought, wow, wouldn't it be useful? And we do this a little bit, but we do it kind of ad hoc. We thought, wouldn't it be useful to give our students, our undergraduate students specifically, more guidance about how to ask for letters of recommendation, how to pursue graduate school. If students come to us in our office hours, we're happy to talk forever about how to apply to graduate school. But it shouldn't take a student having to come to us in our office hours, right? And so we're thinking about how to build that into our capstone meeting and our yearly meeting. So those are some of the ideas we've had. All right, I know it's a lot and I talk fast. So lastly, I just want to touch on a few of the current and future efforts in USD that we're doing as a department. This is kind of just a snapshot. And I first want to focus on things that I think we've done well historically. And then I will switch to things that we have reflected on, particularly because of URGE, that we want to make some changes to. So some things I think we've done pretty well is we've always been quite involved with outreach. Drew Talley, as you know, is intimately involved with Ocean Discovery Institute, which is in City Heights, and it does wonderful things. National Ocean Sciences Bowl is something I'm involved with. We have Bridging the Gap, which is a partnership with Mater Dei Catholic High School and bringing those high school students onto our campus every summer. So there's lots of things that we've been pretty active around outreach. Something else I think we do really well at USD, and especially in our department, is our focus on undergraduate research. For many of you, and graduate research as well. I know we have graduate students, but that's maybe not so atypical for a graduate program. And so for those of you who have been in our undergraduate program, you know that we require a research or internship experience that gives you that hands-on learning. And through programs like McNair Scholars and other programs, you can get funding to do that. And I've brought my students to conferences. Here's me with my undergraduate students a couple years ago at the SACNAS conference. They get to present their work. And we also have a fairly new USD EOSC endowment for undergraduate research, which we're using to supplement funding for undergraduate research beyond the university funding. So some things that we do somewhat, but that we're reflecting on how we can even improve further on, is our curriculum. So something we've always done is we've had interdisciplinary collaborations, for example, team talk classes, but we're really pushing the boundaries on that more and more. For example, Andy Nozel, who is a newer faculty in our department, so you might not know him if you're an older alum, is teaching in the fall our environmental issues class, but he's going to partner with Diane Keeling in the communication studies department to do a module on environmental racism. We've always had some courses focused on environmental justice, particularly taught by our affiliated faculty in philosophy and political science, but we're always trying to find ways for us to increase that, and particularly I'll mention that in terms of how we're thinking about hiring in the next couple of years. But something that we're really excited about, an idea that came out of URGE, is we'd love to have a focus on what's called place-based learning, with an emphasis on indigenous ways of knowing in our curriculum. And not just have it in like one class or a special upper division class, but to have it throughout our curriculum. So to have it in our 100 level class, because we're taking you out into the field, we're going on field trips. Let's talk about where we are. Let's talk about how place, right, and whose land we are relates to what we're studying. And I think it's a really important way to bridge the history of our field with what we're studying now. And so that's something we're having serious conversations about, how to build in throughout our curriculum. Because in the past, it's been more like, oh, one faculty is interested in this and they just bring it into their one class. Something else we're doing, which goes along right with URGE, is implementing these anti-racist policies. So something I think our department's been proud of is that we all value diversity, but as I mentioned in the beginning, we've learned that's really not enough. And something I think our department's not been good on is we tend to be a very informal department. And we like that we hope that we seem approachable to our students, that they can come and talk to us. But we learned, especially through URGE and reflecting, is that when things aren't formalized, it means that if a student has a problem, they might not know where to go. And so we're interested in formalizing reporting guidelines for if there is an incident involving racial harassment or sexual harassment or anything else, that you have someone to go to. There's an ombudsman you can talk to, a way to report this. We've always had a field safety plan, but we're wanting to update that and also put parts of it that are specific guidelines to the faculty's teaching classes about what to do before you embark on a field trip. And then we're also developing a resource map, that's our current deliverable that we're working on, to make sure that our undergraduate and graduate students know the resources out there that are there for them to help them. And then lastly, we're really excited to hire BIPOC faculty within our department. And something that we found is lacking in our current research and curriculum is research related to environmental justice, particularly environmental racism, as it relates to maybe climate change or other environmental issues. And so Noelle might be able to talk a little bit about this more, but we're working with the College of Arts and Sciences to pursue these kind of hires that will be a huge benefit for our department. And then similarly with admissions, as an undergrad institution, admissions obviously goes through the admissions department, but we've always kind of partnered with admissions to a certain extent. For example, yesterday and tomorrow, we're hosting events, Zoom events for incoming students to talk to them about our department, but we'd like to find ways to do that more. One thing, for example, that we've done and we want to expand is participating in Summer Bridge, which is incoming students who are from low-income backgrounds as part of a current group on our campus, SSS, that we can partner with to have a connection with students who might be interested in our major and don't know about us. So yes, that's my presentation.
We are committed to the liberal arts deeply because in the end, it's the liberal arts that are going to educate people to a level where they understand that eliminating racism is critical for education to progress. So I just want to take a moment to talk to you about what the college is doing with these inclusion and diversity initiatives. And we can't go over them all. Jenny just gave you a few examples, so we'll talk to you about broader examples. Over the past 2 semesters, we have had a college initiated interdisciplinary course titled Black Lives Matters, Interdisciplinary Perspectives. 20 faculty are teaching that course. And so each week there's a different group of faculty. Sciences are one, humanities are another. And we think we're going to keep teaching that long into the future as long as we can keep funding it. It's an in-depth insight into the history and culture of Black people in the United States. And Jenny, have you participated in this yet?
No, but Callie did, and I just put it in the chat.
Yeah, you should be doing, you've got a unit ready to go right here. So the college launched a new project to create the first college diversity, equity, inclusion transformational award that recognizes staff and faculty for changing the whole story about diversity on our campus and with the college in particular. We're going to award the first one ever at May 7th at 3:00. So I can't tell you who it is, but I do know. Beginning next fall, the college launches a new Africana studies minor, which will discuss, describe, and debate the many contributions of Black people around the world. We're really excited about that. So I just want to thank you for attending. I hope this event provided you some insight into the social justice issues we're dealing with and what we're working with, and how excited we are to have faculty as engaged and a department as engaged as environmental and ocean sciences. Your department is exemplary, so you should be very proud of it, deeply proud of it.